Welcome, deep divers. Sometimes to really figure out where we're headed, we have to take a journey into, well, some pretty unexpected places and maybe into some unexpected minds, too. What if some of the most radical thinking on freedom, on society, maybe even art, actually involves looking back at cultures we've sometimes, let's be honest, dismissively called primitive, and exploring the depths of the unconscious? So today we're doing a deep dive into a really fascinating intersection. We're looking at the origins of surrealism, specifically its anthropological leanings, and we're putting that alongside Karl Marx's Ethnological Notebooks. Yeah, these are notebooks from his later years, often overlooked. Our sources today, they really challenge conventional wisdom. We've got critical analyses of bourgeois philosophy, detailed studies of indigenous cultures. It's quite a mix. And our mission for you, the listener, is to see how these seemingly very different areas, an avant-garde art movement and the final explorations of a revolutionary economist, how they actually converge in a really powerful critique of modern civilization. We'll try to reveal how their shared search, this quest for like elemental human creativity and this reevaluation of history's so-called savages, offered some surprising ways to understand human freedom and maybe even a vision for a totally transformed society. Okay, let's unpack this. So let's start with Andre Breton. Key figure in surrealism, obviously. At first, his whole exploration of the irrational, the subconscious, was very much through a Freudian lens, right? He even wrote to Freud.
Absolutely. He was definitely digging into the psyche, the hidden currents, using Freud as a guide initially.
Yeah.
But what's really interesting is how his thinking didn't just stay there, focused only on the individual mind.
Right, it broadened out.
Exactly. Breton became this really avid collector of ethnographic objects, stuff from all over the world. And for him, these weren't just, decorations or curios. They were tools.
Tools for what?
Tools to think through, as some scholars put it, a shared human experience, a shared creativity. This is what really pushed surrealism beyond psychology into something more like an anthropological pursuit.
That's fascinating. So it wasn't just about my unconscious, but the unconscious.
Precisely. James Clifford, a scholar who studied this, he identified surrealism as having this international and elemental scope. Its object of study wasn't just the individual, but man, capital M, humanity itself.
Seeking an elemental human spirit.
Yes, and a shared unconscious. Exploring the irrational, sure, but also dreams, the subconscious workings in everyday people across different cultures. It was a search for something fundamentally human, beyond just individual hang-ups.
And this ties into Breton's big idea, psychic automatism. Could you maybe unpack that a bit for us? How does it connect to this wider anthropological view?
Right, psychic automatism. It's basically the idea of thought functioning spontaneously, without the control of reason, without worrying about morals or aesthetics. Think automatic writing, speaking without censoring yourself.
Like tapping directly into the source?
Kind of, yeah. And it connects to anthropology because it resonates with how anthropologists look at diverse forms of human expression globally. Not all cultures prioritize rational, linear thought in the same way the West often does. Automatism was, in a way, trying to access that raw, maybe more universal mode of expression.
It feels almost too perfect, then, that Breton actually met Claude Lévi-Strauss, the giant of structural anthropology, purely by chance, on a ship to New York in 1941.
It's an amazing historical footnote, isn't it? A real symbol of this convergence. Surrealism's quest for the primitive, for these deeper structures of thought, meeting the very person who would formalize structural anthropology.
It really underscores that they were both, in their own ways, trying to get at these underlying patterns in human culture, in myth, in art.
Exactly. Seeing them not just as random, but as expressions of something shared, something fundamental about the human mind and experience.
Okay, so surrealism embraces the irrational, the unconscious, but this must have, I imagine, clash pretty hard with established ideas about freedom, especially within what we might call civilized or bourgeois thought. How did that philosophy tend to misunderstand these concepts?
That's a really critical point. Bourgeois thought often defines liberty in, well, negative terms, as the absence of social organization, or maybe just the deprivation of existing obstacles.
Meaning freedom is just not being stopped from doing something.
Pretty much. Freedom as a lack of constraint, rather than, say, a positive capacity you achieve through understanding and social connection.
And this view, rooted in specific social relations, it led to what one source calls an unconsciousness of causality. What does that mean in practice?
It means a kind of blindness to the deeper societal forces, the causes, that actually shape individual consciousness and behavior. Like you see the individual choices, but not the underlying social mechanics driving them.
So an example might be,
Well, the source gives the example of trying to cure big social problems like war, purely through individual negative actions,
hmm,
things like non-cooperation or passive resistance. The assumption is the individual is inherently free and just needs to withdraw consent. But this misses the complex societal laws and structures that produce things like war in the first place.
right, it ignores the system. So while surrealists were diving into the unconscious for liberation, how did this critique of unconsciousness of causality view that move? Our sources mention that some trends, like the worships of unconscious mentation seen in surrealists, maybe Hemingway, even fascists, could be seen quite negatively.
Yes, as a kind of infantile regression, a pathological retreat from consciousness, seeking some kind of pure feeling, but ultimately avoiding the hard work of conscious understanding and engagement with social reality.
And this critical lens wasn't just aimed at artists, it extended to psychology itself, even Freud.
Definitely. Freud, while obviously a pioneer, is critiqued in these sources as being, let's say, tainted with wish fulfillment because of underlying bourgeois assumptions,
Such as.
such as the idea that consciousness is sui generis, that it just sort of arises from within, independently of social context, or the idea that free will or instincts are only free when they're not constrained by society.
So Freud's view of civilization as basically enslaving our naturally free instincts, that's seen as flawed.
It's characterized as pessimistic and prejudiced in one analysis. The counterargument insists that you can't really study psychology scientifically without sociology. The psyche isn't just instincts, it's shaped profoundly by the social world, by experience.
Which leads to that really powerful line.
Right. Unconsciousness and inexperience, not consciousness and experience, are the jailers of modern bourgeois man. The argument is that true freedom doesn't come from retreating into the unconscious, but from gaining conscious understanding of the necessities, the forces, shaping us, both internally and socially.
Wow. Okay, that idea that society deeply shapes consciousness makes me think, perhaps surprisingly, of Karl Marx, specifically his later work, the Ethnological Notebooks. What was he looking for there? It seems like a shift.
It was definitely a deep dive. These were notes for a major study he never finished. They show him in his later years still searching relentlessly for new paths to revolution. And interestingly, it was also a kind of return to the ambitious, maybe more humanistic projects of his youth in Paris.
And the trigger wasn't purely academic, was it? I read something about poetry playing a role.
Yeah, it's quite surprising. Apparently, reading James Thompson's poem City of Dreadful Night, and also his own translations of Heine, made a powerful impression and partly spurred this deep dive into ethnology.
That connects back to his early idea of poetry being almost like a fourth component of revolutionary thought, doesn't it? Alongside the German philosophy, English economics, French socialism.
Exactly. It suggests he was looking for something more than just economic data, maybe a deeper understanding of human potential, human spirit, you could say.
And central to this was Lewis Henry Morgan's book, Ancient Society. Why did Morgan's work grab Marx so strongly?
It wasn't just the historical information, though that was important. Morgan offered what Marx saw as a merciless critique and condemnation of capitalist civilization. It's telling that Marx's notes on Morgan are way longer and much less sarcastic than his notes on other ethnologists.
He clearly respected Morgan's work.
Immensely. He seemed to dismiss others for, shabby scholarship, Christian hypocrisy, bourgeois ethnocentrism, all that. But Morgan provided something different. An empirical look at societies that functioned on radically different principles.
So what specifically about the Iroquois, the League of the Haudenosaunee, captured Marx's attention? What did he see there?
He saw proof, really, that a complex functioning society could exist without a state in the way he understood it. He notes the state did not exist, and yet principles like liberty, equality, and fraternity, even though they weren't written down as slogans, were fundamental lived principles.
Their leaders, the sachems.
They had none of the marks of a priesthood, no religious authority tied to political power in that way. Morgan himself called the Iroquois Confederation a masterpiece of Indian wisdom. For Marx, this was evidence that freedom and equality could arise organically from collective structures.
And it wasn't just politics. The role of women really stood out to him too, didn't it?
Absolutely. Our sources emphasize this point. The women were the great power among the clans. Think about that. They had a real voice in the Council of the Gens, where every adult, male and female, participated.
And they could actually depose chiefs.
Yes, they could knock off the horns, as the saying went, from a chief's head. They held the power of the original nomination. This was radically different from the patriarchal structures Marx was critiquing in Europe.
Morgan himself saw this as pointing towards a future evolution of the family, didn't he?
He did. Morgan predicted the family structure must change as society changes, until genuine equality of the sexes is attained. For Marx, seeing this in practice among the Iroquois wasn't just interesting, it was a concrete example of a different, potentially more egalitarian way of life.
And Marx wasn't just interested in the big structures. He noted down very specific details, right? Little glimpses of daily life.
Oh, yeah. His notebooks are full of them. Things like the bell-shaped houses of some Venezuelan tribes, how the Iroquois used elm and basswood bark to make twine. He noted the Shawnee belief in metempsychosis, souls being reborn.
Like reincarnation.
Sorta, yeah.
Yeah.
And he even transcribed the details of an Iroquois grace ceremony, this long, shrill cry, then a group response followed by evenings of dance. It shows he was trying to grasp the texture, the vitality of these cultures.
Which led him to a pretty stark conclusion when comparing them to capitalist society.
A very stark conclusion. He wrote that these primitive communities had incomparably greater vitality. He felt Iroquois society was much higher in terms of, get this, subjective human sensuality than societies poisoned by the pestilential breath of civilization.
So, connecting this back, he wasn't just being romantic about the past.
Not at all. He was finding empirical evidence, real-world examples of the possibilities for a free cooperative society that had actually existed. It challenged the idea that capitalism was the inevitable or only path forward.
And this deeper ethnographic study seems to have genuinely shifted his thinking on revolution itself, making it more flexible maybe. I'm thinking of that letter to Vierzosalik in 1881.
That's a key moment.
Right.
The letter exists in 4 drafts, which shows how carefully he was thinking it through. He explicitly states that the historical inevitability of capitalism, the stages he outlined in Capital, were really restricted to the countries of Western Europe.
Meaning Russia might not have to go through the whole capitalist development phase?
Exactly. He suggested the Russian rural commune, the Obshchina, could potentially serve as a fulcrum for social regeneration, allowing Russia to possibly skip the capitalist stage.
Which must have sounded like heresy to some of his followers.
Oh, absolutely. The source calls it a flagrantly anti-Marxist heresy for his more dogmatic Russian disciples, who, ironically, had become sort of admirers of capitalism as a necessary step. But Marx himself was supporting the revolutionary populists, the Narodnaya Volya, even their more extreme tactics. He wasn't bound by his own earlier frameworks if new evidence suggested other possibilities. And this late period also saw him deepening his already strong anti-statism, especially after the Paris Commune and his critique of religion.
How did the ethnology connect to religion?
His notes suggest he saw religion really taking root as class society developed, as genuine cooperation and common property started to fade. He even speculated that earlier, truly communal ancestors might have been effectively atheists, with belief in gods emerging alongside class divisions and hierarchy.
This flexibility, this willingness to revise, it makes sense of that famous line attributed to him, "I am no Marxist."
Precisely. It wasn't him disowning his work. It was a rejection of how others were turning his living ideas into rigid dogma, reification, and caricature, as one source puts it, treating his analysis like fixed scripture instead of a tool for understanding a constantly changing reality. His personal motto, after all, was doubt everything. He was always self-correcting.
So, bringing all these threads together, the critique of bourgeois thought, the insights from ethnology, what does this tell us about Marx's final vision? What did total revolution mean in this context?
Well, if you look at the critique of bourgeois philosophy that split between mechanism and idealism, subject and object, theory and practice, Marx saw that split as a product of class society itself. Consciousness becomes concentrated in the ruling class, detached from the activity of the majority.
So dialectical materialism wasn't just an abstract philosophy for him.
No, it was about actively healing that split, restoring consciousness to activity, reuniting theory with practice. A total revolution, then, had to be about much more than just changing economic structures or political power. It had to be about fundamentally transforming human experience and our relationship with the world.
And this is where it really clicks back surprisingly strongly with surrealism, isn't it?
It really does. This late synthesis in Marx focusing on primal peoples, the power of imagination, myth, and ritual, trying to reconcile humanity and nature, it's described as incomparably more radical than much orthodox Marxism. And remarkably, very close to the point of departure of surrealism.
That phrase, the communism of genius, which was used to describe surrealism, it captures that sense of tapping into a collective, creative, liberated human potential.
Exactly. There's this shared focus on a deeper, more integrated human experience, bridging the revolutionary impulse with the artistic and the anthropological.
And just as a final note on Morgan, the anthropologist who influenced Marx so much, he wasn't just an academic observer either, was he? He had his own radical streaks.
That's right. The sources mention he wrote sympathetic notes about the Paris Commune in his diary. He publicly defended the Sioux against mistreatment, and even did pioneering work on animal behavior and, arguably, animal rights in his book on beavers. He apparently wrote that man was just as much made to be food for the bear, a really fascinating, forward-thinking individual.
So quite a journey we've taken. We've seen how surrealism, starting with Freud but moving towards anthropology, and Karl Marx in his final years turning to ethnology, both ended up mounting these really deep critiques of modern civilization.
Yeah, critiques drawn from studying the unconscious on one hand and primitive societies on the other, both challenging our basic ideas about freedom, about consciousness, about how society even works.
Pushing beyond rigid doctrines, whether psychological or economic, to embrace a much more complex picture of human potential.
A picture rooted in ongoing discovery, not fixed answers.
Okay, so here's a final thought for you, our listeners, to take away. If that critique we discussed is right, if unconsciousness and inexperience are the real prisons of modern life, what primitive insights, what deeply human ways of knowing or being might we be collectively ignoring today? And could reconnecting with those insights actually unlock new paths? Paths towards a future that's more conscious, more free, and maybe more whole for all of us. Something to think about until our next deep dive.